Welcome to Random Movie Reviews. I'm Nathan, and today I'll be talking about the Gamera Trilogy. So, full disclosure, I was originally going to do a review focusing around 5 Toho Godzilla movies that I'd never seen before. I wanted to do this after watching Godzilla Minus One because I really love that movie, and I just wanted to get more familiar with the Godzilla lore and history in cinema, because it is the longest running film franchise of all time. I believe it still holds that record to this day, and it's just been a blind spot for me. And I love movies, and I love exploring new movies outside of usually my realm of knowledge, and so I wanted to give 5 Godzilla movies a shot. I wasn't really interested in watching all the films in order because most movies have very loose continuity anyway. I based which 5 films I was going to watch to whatever movies were available to me, as well as my overall interest in the film and what their reputations were amongst the fan base. That was the original plan, until I got sidetracked by a badass kaiju turtle by the name of Gamera. So for those who may not know, Gamera has a long-running history similar to that of Godzilla. He was kind of a knockoff Godzilla, but he was meant to be more kid-friendly, meant to be more heroic, and kind of seen as like a kaiju superhero, if you will. Now, the reason I got really interested in Gamera is because upon doing research about kaiju movies, this era of Gamera, which is known as the Heisei era, that took place from 1995 to I think 2006 when they rebooted Gamera again. There were 4 films that came out, and then 3 of those films were a trilogy directed by a filmmaker who made a Godzilla movie called GMK, which is one of the 5 Godzilla movies that I was planning on watching and did watch actually. But I wanted to give these movies a shot because I'd never heard of them, and it would be interesting to see how they measured up to the 3 Godzilla movies that I ended up watching before watching these movies. Well, I guess I should preface this by saying that the 3 Godzilla movies I watched were Godzilla Destroy All Monsters from 1968, Godzilla GMK, which is the fan title. I'm not going to say the long title. It's super clunky and I don't remember it. Which was the film that came out in 2001. And then the film following that, which was Godzilla Against Mechagodzilla. These 3 movies just kind of, I was interested in them based on their reputation and based on how they looked. And for Godzilla Destroy All Monsters and Godzilla Against Mechagodzilla, fun, campy ridiculousness. Can't really be mad at it, but there's really nothing to sink your teeth into. It's kind of a generic, albeit kind of cheap, but fun monster movies. Can't really be mad at it. Godzilla GMK, on the other hand, I found to be really boring, and that's going to be a hot take amongst Godzilla fans. I'm sorry. I don't know why this movie is so highly regarded. It looks really cheap, and the story was not interesting at all, and all the characters were flat. All of the monster stuff looked bad. Godzilla looks really bad in GMK. And frankly, so does the other monsters. They look like overgrown Happy Meals toys. I guess you could say that for a lot of Godzilla movies, but it just really stuck out to me in this one, especially considering the era that it was made, which was in 2001. I thought they would have done a little bit better. So yeah, didn't really like it. But what surprised me the most was that filmmaker directed these Gamera movies. And so after I watched Godzilla Against Mechagodzilla, I was like, you know what? I want to watch these Gamera movies. I'm just going to do a side thing. And I wasn't originally planning doing a video on these movies, but I figured not a lot of people know about these movies. And I really ended up liking this trilogy a lot, with the exception of one film, which I'll get into, which is also controversial. But overall, these movies were better than all of the Godzilla movies, with the exception of Minus One, which is in a class of its own, really. So that I'm not comparing that. That's not really that fair. But these movies were better. They looked better. The monster stuff looked incredible, especially given the time that they were made. The use of practical effects with the monster stuff and the miniatures and compositing shots. And I couldn't believe this was the same filmmaker who made GMK, which frankly, that movie felt like a made-for-TV special. It looked so cheap, where these movies looked genuinely cinematic, like all the way through. So yeah, I want to talk about these movies, and I'm going to do it a little bit differently than I normally do. I have a Letterboxd account. I'll link it in the description below for those who also have accounts and may be interested, where I write in-depth reviews about certain movies. And I did this for all 3 films because I wasn't originally planning on doing a video. But I figured, well, I have these in-depth reviews about Gamera, the giant, awesome, badass kaiju turtle who can turn into a UFO. I love it. I love that. And I figured this would be a good time for me to go a little bit more in depth, because when I do these videos, I do it off the top of my head. I don't read off a script. This one, I'm going to be kind of reading off a script. I'm reading my reviews to give you guys my overall impression of these movies. So with all that being said, we're going to start with the first film in this trilogy, which is Gamera, Guardian of the Universe. I am by no means an expert on the kaiju genre, but ever since I first watched Godzilla Minus One and absolutely loved it, I've developed an interest in the genre and have been doing research on which films I should watch based on their reputations amongst fans. It didn't take me long to stumble upon the Heisei Gamera Trilogy while doing my research, because these films in particular are seen by many to be some of the finest films that the kaiju genre has to offer, and after just finishing the first film, I have to say, this movie pleasantly surprised me. Gamera, Guardian of the Universe doesn't necessarily do anything groundbreaking in terms of kaiju storytelling. The plot is basic and is more or less very standard for this genre, but it's the execution of everything that elevates this Gamera film over its genre cliches. The look of the monsters, and more importantly, the way they were filmed against its miniatures and used in composite shots, are some of the best practical effects I've seen amongst kaiju films thus far. This film as a whole is very pleasing to look at and is very cinematic throughout. This alone makes Gamera, Guardian of the Universe better than most of the other Toho Godzilla movies I've seen, where a lot of those movies, even the ones made in the early 2000s, GMK, looking at you, look very cheap by comparison. But Gamera does falter for me in the same area where most other kaiju films falter, and that's with its lackluster characters. It's not that the characters in this movie are terrible or dumb by any means, it's just that none of them are particularly interesting and are only used to push the narrative of the film along. I'll put it this way. If one of the main characters in this film died, I wouldn't have been devastated like I would have been had Koichi died in Godzilla Minus One. But outside of that gripe, I had a good time with Gamera, Guardian of the Universe. This film was well directed, well paced, and well executed with its badass, giant monster fight scenes. The final fight specifically was so awesome that I watched it twice. So yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing the rest of this trilogy. Yeah, this is a really fun movie, and like I said, it doesn't necessarily do anything groundbreaking in terms of storytelling for this type of genre, but everything is executed so well. And for anyone who's interested in these movies, they are available to watch for free on both Tubi and Amazon Prime. So yeah, with that being said, let's get into my favorite Gamera film of this trilogy, which is Gamera 2: Attack of Legion. Gamera delivers yet again with another banger of a kaiju movie, and one that is even better than the first film. Like all superior sequels, Gamera 2 takes everything from its predecessor that was great and simply gives us more of it. We get more action, more destruction, more scenes of Gamera being a badass giant turtle, and more terrific practical kaiju filmmaking. Attack of Legion also manages to improve on some elements from the first movie, such as having better pacing and a better villain. Legion is seriously one of the most impressive practical made monsters I've ever seen in a kaiju film. But this sequel also carries over some of the weaknesses of its first movie, which is primarily that of underwritten and underdeveloped human characters. And once again, it's not like these human characters are terrible, they're just in service of moving the plot forward and don't really offer anything else of substance. My other minor gripe with Gamera 2 is that there is a strange subplot where the military is arguing about whether or not they can trust Gamera, even though this sequel only takes place a year later after the first film, where it was already established that Gamera is a defender of the Earth. So did everybody in Japan just get collective amnesia or something? But the military eventually does decide to aid Gamera in his battle with Legion, and that leads to one of my favorite scenes in this movie, where the military salutes Gamera after his victorious win over Legion. Great stuff. Gamera 2 is another great kaiju movie that is exceptionally well made and is super fun to watch. Yeah, Attack of Legion really surprised me with how entertaining it was, and there's a lot of the first half of the movie has these great kind of B-movie horror elements where, you know, Legion has all these like alien space bugs that are growing everywhere, and so it starts off really creepy, and then the action just builds up from there. And Legion, like I said, Legion is just such a crazy looking kaiju monster, and the fact that that was done practically, there's a guy in a suit in that fucking thing, and it looks so good. And yeah, so everything that makes the first Gamera film great This one just expands on it even more. And the stories of these movies, with the exception of the third one, which gets a little bit more complex, are very straightforward. Basically, Gamera is a kaiju hero who's meant to defend the Earth from other monsters. That's about the plot. And from the first film and the second film, the only thing that really differs in terms of plot are the villains themselves and how Gamera goes about fighting them. And then there's some human elements around that kind of differ from one another. But overall, very straightforward stories, nothing really too complex. But what elevates those movies is how well everything is made and looks, and they're just fun. I had so much fun with the first two Gamera films, and they were significantly better than all the other Godzilla movies I watched, except -1. Let's face it, -1 is in a completely different category. But I was really surprised. I was like, how come these movies aren't talked about more? This is awesome. This is like, if I were to ever introduce somebody to kaiju movies, and like I said, I'm no expert, I would recommend the first two Gamera films. Some people are probably watching this going, hey, Nathan, how come you're not mentioning the third one? What's the deal with that? I'm sorry, Gamera fans. Because I know that the third film in particular is the most beloved out of this entire trilogy. I know that it's often looked at as being maybe the best kaiju film ever made outside of Godzilla films. I disagree. Well, this is going to be a very hot take with most Gamera fans. Although there are elements of Gamera 3, Revenge of Iris that I enjoyed overall, I did find this movie to be a significant step down from its predecessors in terms of entertainment value, visuals, direction, pacing, and storytelling. I will give Gamera 3 a lot of credit for being the most ambitious of the trilogy, especially regarding its human drama. The film is centered around a young girl named Ayana, whose family was accidentally killed by Gamera during his fight with Gaios at the end of the first film. Ayana discovers a mysterious egg in her village that eventually hatches a new creature whom she names Iris and plans on raising it to destroy Gamera out of revenge for the death of her family. On paper, that is a very interesting plot for a kaiju film that offers a surprising amount of depth for its human character. In its execution, however, Gamera 3 doesn't genuinely explore the trauma behind Ayana's loss, and rather just uses her feelings of revenge towards Gamera as a justification for the film's plot. Compare this to Godzilla -1, where the human protagonist of that film, Koichi, is deeply developed throughout, and the audience gets to see numerous scenes of him grappling with these internal struggles of trauma, loss, and guilt. I really like the idea behind Ayana's character and her story. I just wish the film executed all of that much more efficiently. The other major issue I had with Gamera 3 was how needlessly convoluted it makes its plot by adding a lot of unnecessary expository dialogue that just really drags the pacing of the film down by a lot. Those moments made me appreciate the first two films even more due to how streamlined and simple their plots were by comparison, and because of that, Gamera 1 and 2 move at a much more efficient pace than Revenge of Iris does. Then there's the issue of all the other lackluster characters, which I've talked about in all the other Gamera films thus far. Many of the characters from the first movie return in this one, and they are just as utilitarian and generic as they were the first time around, but admittedly, that is an issue that bothered me more in this film than it did in the previous two, solely because Gamera 3 spends so much more time with these characters, and to be quite frank, it gets boring to watch because there's little to no depth to any of them. And finally, the lack of Gamera scenes is a real bummer, especially coming off the heels of Gamera 2, where we not only got the most Gamera screen time, but also get easily the best action and the best villain, Legion, of the whole trilogy. Iris looked more like a giant mech rather than an alien creature, and the fight between him and Gamera is criminally short. There's also a lot of cheap-looking CGI in this movie, and it doesn't look nearly as great as the practical effects of the first two films. Overall, I like the idea behind Gamera 3, and I like some of the Gamera action towards the climax of the film, but outside of that, I don't understand why this film is so highly regarded amongst fans. Personally, I don't think it holds a candle to the first two Gamera movies. Yeah, this one disappointed me, and I think part of that is because there was so much hype behind it after me reading 5-star after 5-star after 5-star reviews from people on Letterboxd, like, this is a perfect movie, it's a perfect monster movie, it's amazing, it's a deconstruction of the genre. And look, like I mentioned in my review, I acknowledge that the film is trying to be deeply ambitious with its storytelling and presenting the kaiju hero Gamera in a light that is kind of more realistic. Like, well, there would be accidental casualties if this giant turtle monster was fighting other monsters in a major city and accidentally knocking down buildings. Some casualties will get in the way. It's an interesting thing to explore. Like I mentioned, it's not explored deeply at all. It's more or less just an excuse for this movie to have a plot. They don't explore Ayana's character and the trauma she's feeling. It's more like, oh, my parents died. I'm sad about that. Oh, here's a monster. I'm going to get this monster to kill Gamera because I want revenge. And that's about as deep as it gets. Yeah, Gamera 3 overall, it was a bit disappointing, but it still looks good when there isn't terrible CGI, and I love the design of Gamera, and I love some of the very brief fight scenes. I mean, that was the other thing, is that the final fight in this was like really short, and we're like, I wish it was kind of more epic. And then on top of that, the movie ends with like a kind of a cliffhanger kind of ending, and it's like, okay, but we know we don't get another Gamera film that's attached to this trilogy, so that was disappointing. So overall, yeah, Gamera 3 didn't really work for me, but the first two really did. And I'm also curious about seeing the soft reboot that came out, I think in 2004, maybe 2006, Gamera the Brave, which is, as far as I'm aware, the last Gamera film that's been made. Haven't seen that one yet, but because I love the first two movies so much, I ended up ordering the Arrow Video Blu-ray box set on Amazon, and that's how I'm going to watch it. So I might do a review of that later. But anyway, yeah, these are fun movies, and I'm glad I watched them. And yeah, I still might do that Godzilla video in the future. We'll see. But yeah, so this is a little side thing that I did instead that I had fun doing. So thanks for watching.